Hello everyone and Assalamu alaikum. This is Introduction to Psychology Part 1 PSY 312 by Dear Knowledge. Okay, last time in the lesson 2 of chapter 5, which was about perception. So in lesson 2 we discussed about the shape of we have started the topic of the perception of shape, in which we discussed the figure ground relationship, and after that we discussed the sequence of perceptual experiences, and then after that we discussed the salient characteristics of figure and ground relationship. So if you haven't watched that video, I've given a link in description. In case if I forgot, do remind me in the comment section and I will share the link of those videos with you. So in this video we'll start with the perceptual organization and grouping. So, under the topic of perceptual organization and grouping, we'll be discussing about some major topics, which is the perceptual urge to organize. And after that, we'll discuss the Gestalt grouping principles, in which we'll discuss the different laws of a Gestalt psychology, different laws that were given by the Gestalt psychologists. So in this video we'll discuss about the law of similarity, law of closure, law of good continuation, law of proximity, law of Pragnanz, law of simplicity, the law of wholeness, the law of connectivity, and law of figure and ground relationship, law of contour, law of good figure, law of contrast, and law of adaptability. So all these different laws that have been searched and taken from different books. So the references would include Psychology, a book by Hockenberry, and Experimental Psychology by Hardeep, and General Psychology, and some other notes of mine. So that's why this video will include lots of laws that are related to perceptual grouping and Gestalt grouping principles. So let's start with the perceptual organization and grouping. So when we perceive a form, we often group different elements of it together, and many of the forms we perceive are composed of a number of different elements that seem together, and it would be more accurate to say that we actively organize the elements to try to produce the stable perception of a well-defined whole object. And this is what perceptual psychologist Stanley Coren and his colleague in 1999 refers to as the urge to organize. Urge to organize, which we'll be discussing in this video. So the perceptual organization and grouping would include the law of grouping, which refers to the tendency to perceive the stimuli in some organized and meaningful patterns by grouping them. And according to this law, all the stimuli existing in the environment can be organized and grouped, and only they can lead to the meaningful perception. So it is clear that by perceptual organization and grouping we can have meaningful perception, and this grouping is done on the basis of laws, which we will be discussing in this video, the laws of perception. So law of grouping, which comes under the topic of perceptual organization and grouping, this include law of proximity, law of similarity, law of good continuation, and closure, law of closureness, which we'll be discussing in this video. So let's start with the perceptual urge to organize. As I have already discussed that the perceptual psychologist Stanley Coren and his colleague in 1999 refers to as the urge to organize. And what sort of principles do we follow when we try to organize visual perceptions? So the perceptual urge to organize, as you can see, as you can scan this image right in front of you, you will experience firsthand the strong psychological tendency to organize visual elements to arrive at the perception of whole figure, forms and shapes. So notice that you shift your gaze across the patterns. You momentarily perceive circles, squares, and other geometrical forms right here in this picture. So this is what the perceptual urge to organize means, that if you just consider it as a whole, you will only see it as a geometrical shape. But if you pay more attention to its different forms, so you will see different geometrical shapes and other designs, etc. Now let's start with the Gestalt grouping principle. The Gestalt psychologist studied how the perception of visual elements became organized into patterns, shapes, and forms, and they identified several laws or principles that we tend to follow in grouping elements together to arrive at a to a perception of form, shapes, and figures. So these principles, which comes under the law of grouping, would include similarity, closure, good continuation, and proximity. And the other principles would include love Pragnanz, love simplicity, love wholeness, love connectivity, love figure and grouping relationship, love contour, love good figure, love contrast, and love adaptability. So this psychologist makes Wertheimer in 1880 to 1943, and Kurt Kofka and Wolfgang Kohler, they described that the wholeness of the situation is more important than the parts. So they found that the organization applies certain principles in organizing and in organizing the perception, and all these perceptual principles are related to the wholeness of the situation. So the rules identified by the Gestalt psychologist are applied even to 6-month-old infants, and some of the other important laws which we'll be discussing in this video. So let's start with the law of similarity. The Gestalt psychologist formulated several basic principles of perceptual organization. Uh, we tend to follow these principles in grouping elements together to arrive at the perception of shapes, forms, and figures. So the law of similarity is the tendency to perceive objects of similar size, shape, or color as a unit or a figure. So you perceive 4 horizontal rows of holiday cookies rather than 6 vertical columns of cookies in this picture. And the next about the law of similarity is that similar elements tend to be grouped together and perceived as one pattern or whole than the dissimilar ones. And the principle of similarity, or the law of similarity, it also proposes that the elements that look similar tend to be viewed as a part of the same object. So the next one is about the law of closureness, and the law of closureness is the tendency to fill in the gaps or contours in an incomplete image. So you perceive the 2 circles on the face of the clock as smooth, continuous circle, even though the curved lines are actually interrupted by the hands of the clock and the hands of the person and the edge of the photograph, as you can see right here. So this is what we'll say about the law of closureness, that law of closureness is what we'll say that it proposes the interpretation that produce closed rather than open figures are favored. And as you can see right in this picture, which also describe about the law of closureness and law of closure. The next one is about the law of good continuation. The law of good continuation is the tendency to group elements that appear to follow the same direction as a single unit or figure. So in this picture, right in front of you, good continuation is reflected in the strong tendency to identify the straight sections of highway as continuous units and the curved sections of highway as a continuous unit. Now, the principle or the law of good continuation also proposes, or you can say in other words, that when we are faced with multiple ways to view a stimulus, we tend to follow a path of continuation. This means that contours based on smooth continuity are preferred to abrupt changes of direction. And this is how the law of good continuation work. Now, the next law include the law of proximity. The law of proximity is the tendency to perceive objects that are close to one another as a unit or a figure. So you perceive these six people in the picture, shown in the picture, as two groups or three. So this is one of the example of the law of proximity. And the elements or stimuli which are physically near to each other are perceived as part or pattern and make as one whole. On the other hand, the elements that stand out distance are perceived as another pattern. So the proximity proposes that the law of proximity, or the principle of proximity, proposes that the elements that are close together tend to be viewed as part of the same object. And as you can see again in this picture, you might see them as three groups or two groups just because of the law of proximity. And about the law of Pragnanz and the law of simplicity. So the Gestalt psychologists also formulated a general principle called the law of Pragnanz and the law of simplicity. So this law states that when several perceptual organization of an assortment of visual elements are possible, the perceptual interpretation that occurs will be one that produces the best, simplest, and the most stable shape. And according to Gestalt psychologists, the law of Pragnanz encompasses all the Gestalt principles, including the figure-ground relationship. And the implication of the law of Pragnanz is that our perceptual system works in an economical way to produce the interpretation of stable and consistent forms. And the law of efficient the ability to efficiently organize elements into stable objects help us perceive the world accurately. So in effect, we actively and automatically construct a perception that reveals the essence of something, which is roughly what the German word Pragnanz mean, the essence of something. So through the Gestalt principles of forms perception are simple. They describe much of the perceptual organization. So it is important to understand that these principles are descriptive rather than explanatory, and the feature detector approach that has been described, it also attempt to link the perception of forms to functions. So if you haven't watched that video, I will share the link of those videos. If you want, I will share the link of those videos in the comment section as well as in the description box. Now the next law include the law of wholeness. Uh, this law states that the total situation is perceived immediately as a whole. And this law of wholeness was given by Gestalt psychologist. Gestalt in German language implies the organized structure. So according to this law, which is perceived first in perception and then whole is perceived first in perception, and the other parts are visualized. So whole of a situation is more important. Then the next lies the law of connectivity. When any object or any stimulus or any shape, when they are uniform and linked, we perceive spots, lines, or areas as a single unit if they are uniform and linked. Then the next law is about law of figure and ground relationship, and I've already uploaded a lecture on law of figure and ground relationship. If you haven't watched that video, I will also provide the link of this video too. So according to this law, figure is perceived perfectly only due to the background, and in figure and ground relationship, figure is more prominent on the basis of its ground. And we have also discussed in our previous lectures on the law of figure and ground relationship that figure and ground refers to the most basic and elementary of all forms of perceptual structure. And we perceive an object as a figure in a ground, and we perceive a picture on a page. The picture is a figure, and the page is a ground. So if you haven't watched that video on figure and ground relationship, you can also check the description box for this link too, and I'll provide the link of this video. Now the next lies about the law of contour. According to this principle, an object is seen or perceived perfectly due to the contour. A contour is said to be boundary existing between a figure and its background, and the degree of quality of contour separating the figure from the ground is responsible for indicating the perceiver to organize the stimuli or objects into meaningful patterns or perception. So this law of contours helps in organizing the perception. So if there is no boundary between the figure and ground, then figure will not be perceived separately from the ground. For example, some clouds in the sky can't be separated from the light blue sky as they looked merged as there is no separate boundary or contour. Now, the next law is about the law of good figure. Now, according to this law, there is a tendency to organize things to make a boundary or symmetrical figure that includes all the parts. And so a figure including all the parts will be considered as good figure, and this can be organized easily. The next lies about the law of contrast. So perceptual organization is very much effective by the contrast effect. The stimuli that are in a sharp contrast draw a maximum attention. For example, a very short man standing among the tall, and also the contrast of black and white. Then the next and the last law is about the law of adaptability. So, according to this law, the perceptual organization for some stimuli depends upon the adaptability of the perceiver to perceive similar stimuli. Now, for example, an individual who has adapted herself or himself to work before the intense bright light will perceive the normal sunlight as quite dim. Now, similarly, our sense organs or organs of touch or smell and taste may also get accustomed or adapted to certain degree of stimulation, and getting habituated to this kind of stimulation may strongly affect the perception. So thus all these principles which we have discussed are important in the organization of perception, and these principles facilitate perception, which further leads to meaningful organization of the object in the environment. So the major weakness of Gestalt laws of organization is that laws are only descriptive statements, and they fail to explain why it is that similar visual um, similar visual elements or those close together are grouped together. Now, another limitation of the laws of organization is that most of the laws relate um, primarily to the perceived organization of the two-dimensional patterns. However, it is extremely difficult to apply the Gestalt laws of organization to certain complex visual stimulus or stimuli. So this was the end of the video. If your concept is clear, you can click on the like button. If not, you can ask us in the comment section, and we will be happy to help you out. Plus, if you're new to this channel, you can subscribe to our channel, click on the bell icon so you will never ever miss any notification from your knowledge. And you can also share the link of this video and channel with your family members and friends, because sharing is caring. Until then, Allah Hafiz.